Scriptures today will be taken from the book of Exodus, chapter 33, verse 12 to 23. One day Moses said to the Lord, "You've been telling me, take these people up to the promised land, but you haven't told me whom you will send with me. You have told me, I know you by name, and I look favorably on you. If it is true that you look favorably on me, let me know your ways, so I may understand you more fully and continue to enjoy your favor. And remember that this nation is your very own people." The Lord replied, "I will personally go with you, Moses, and I will give you rest. Everything will be fine for you." Then Moses said, "If you don't personally go with us, don't make us leave this place. How will anyone know that you look favorably on me and on your people? If you don't go with us, for your presence among us set your people and me apart from all other people on the earth." The Lord replied to Moses, "I will indeed do what you have asked, for I look favorably on you, and I know you by name." Moses responded, "Then show me your glorious presence." The Lord replied, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will call out my name, Yahweh, before you. For I will show mercy to anyone I choose, and I will show compassion to anyone I choose. But you may not look directly at my face, for no one may see me and live." The Lord continued, "Look, stand near me on this rock. As my glorious presence passes by, I will hide you in the crevice of the rock, and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand and let you see me from behind. But my face will not be seen." Amen. Now the message today, entitled "Seeking God's Face, Finding God's Button." Let's welcome dear Reverend David Alexander, 亚大卫牧师。
感谢。Let us pray. Oh Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are our rock and our salvation. Amen. Favorite musicians from our teenage years fade over time. I can testify to that truth, but I have one exception to the rule. Judy Collins. She's now 78 years old, and I would go almost anywhere, and I would pay almost anything to be at a concert if Judy were to be on stage. But I don't have to. Through the magic of the internet and YouTube, I can call up just about anything that Judy ever performed on camera, and I can call up anything she ever recorded in a studio, and I can listen to that and be transported. From the time I first fell in love with Judy, her voice and her way of being on stage, I regarded whatever she sang as a Judy Collins song. But only later I learned that though she wrote a lot of songs, much of what she performed had been written by others. In the late 1960s and the early 1970s, she performed and recorded a lot of songs originally written by the Canadian poets Joni Mitchell and Leonard Cohen. The combination of Cohen's or Mitchell's lyrics and Judy Collins' voice can, at times, pierce me to my heart and almost send me my knees. So when I looked at this week's suggested Old Testament reading, Exodus chapter 33, verses 12 through 23, a few lines from a Leonard Cohen poem floated up in my memory. Of course, they floated up in Judy Collins' voice. But they shape how I listened to the story of Moses in his conversation with God. The lines are this: I saw a beggar leaning on his wooden crutch. He said to me, "You must not ask for so much." And a pretty woman who was leaning in her darkened door, she cried to me, "Hey, why not ask for more?" So let's start with the pretty woman, whose question is a reflection on what Moses was doing in his conversation with God in the story that we just read from the Bible. The stories in Exodus are about God's rescue of the people out of slavery and into freedom. God is the main character in Exodus. The next most important character in Exodus is Moses. They were a powerful pair. You could call them a dynamic duo if you wanted to get all Batman about it. And although in the stories God never forgets who's in charge, sometimes Moses is a little shaky on the subject. Chapter 32, the one that was right before the story that we read, starts with these people they were on their way to freedom, and they turned away from worshiping God. They turned away from obedience to Moses, decided to make an idol of an agricultural deity they had known when they were enslaved, and then to have a party. As that story develops, God got angry and decided to wipe them out and start over again from Moses all by himself. Then God tells Moses that plan, and Moses gives God some pushback. He convinced God to change. He convinced God to repent. And God repented and decided not to do that. The result was that instead of getting wiped out, those people got sick. And then they were told, "Get away from my mom." Chapter 33 is about their departure. And it's about how a place was made for Moses to have an intimate face-to-face conversations with God. And it says face-to-face. But he didn't have to go up to a mountain to do it. He had a place called the Tent of Meeting. And the story we read today happens inside the Tent of Meeting. Once again, God and Moses are having a conversation. Coming off of this great victory, Moses had argued God out of being angry. He moved another step. He asked God for different privileges. The first one was he asked God, "I want to know your plans." And God says, "Okay, I plan for you to win." Pretty good. Then he asked God to accompany the people as we go. If we don't have you with us, we're not leaving. And God says, "Okay, I'll go with you all the way." And that's when the voice of Leonard Cohen's pretty woman leaning at her darkened door seems to come through, saying, "Why not ask for more?" So Moses asked to see the dazzling light of God's presence. Moses is kind of like us. His first request was for something that would make him a better leader. His second request is for something that would help the people who he was leading. And then the third request was for something that would just make him feel good. It would have no benefit for the people, nor for Moses' ability to lead the people. It was for him and for him alone. It's kind of like if you're writing a doctoral dissertation. Maybe some of us here have done that. You write a doctoral dissertation, you ask for wisdom so you can write clearly and please your advisors. Then you ask for that whatever you produce in your doctoral dissertation will be of benefit to science. And then you start hoping that you can get a patent or publish a book and become rich and famous out of the whole thing. Leonard Cohen's poem didn't only have a pretty lady at the door. There was also the beggar leaning on his wooden crutch, reminding us, you must not ask for so much. Moses had gained forgiveness and life for the people he was leading. He gained a vision of the future that would help him continue to lead them. He got what he asked for again, with the assurance that God would not abandon them or leave them in their own devices. He was, as the expression puts it, he was on a roll. Everything was going his way. But then he went too far and he was brought up short of his goal. Not because God didn't love him, but because, if you follow the story, what he asked for was likely to lead to his own death. God said, you can have a lot. You can be in the presence of my glory. You can hear my name, but you can't see my face, because that'll kill you. In that way, God was like a parent who says to a child, you have the freedom of the house. You can eat any of the food that's in the house. It's all for you. But you can't go running out in the street in front of the house because you'll get knocked down by a motorcycle. Moses asked to see the dazzling light of God's presence. That's a very simple English translation of one Hebrew word, chabod, or kabod, which otherwise is translated in English as your glory. That's the only time the word kabod is used in this story. Moses uses it. God talks back about face, a different Hebrew word. But even that, even face, which is less than glory, would be too much for Moses. And that's where the pictures on the screen might begin to make some sense. Because what God promised to allow Moses to see was my backside. The Hebrew word for backside here is achri, which is the word for the backside of a cow. The story ends where the cow did. You can see the backside of the cow, and then the story ends. Chapter 34 starts a new story. Moses had been seeking to see God's face, but he was permitted only to see God's backside. And apparently that was just going to have to be enough for him. In many cases, the face of something really doesn't tell us anything particularly that we need to know about it, though. Edith Wharton, an American writer who spent most of her writing life in France, in a 1905 novel, The Age of Innocence, The House of Mirth, that's right. She set the novel in about 1890 among the upper class people of New York City. These were the city's finest people. Their wealth came from their ancestors, and it had been for generations in the same family. These people seemed at times to really like each other, but they were very unkind to anybody, women or men, who lost their money and had to drop out of high society. They especially disliked people who had recently become wealthy, had new money, and wanted to enter high society. The attitudes of these finest people were not fine attitudes at all. If you want to see something more recent in it, I think we need the next slide. Yes, if you want something more recent, more contemporary, the same thing, it's Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy. In those stories, the pure-blood people were the ones most likely to be deceived, most likely to go bad. They didn't like anybody who wasn't their kind. In my 20s, I met an old guy. He told me about a job he once had. He worked in a factory that received a liquid product in barrels and put it into glass bottles. The liquid product was Scotch whiskey. His job was to put the labels on the bottles. The labels were from many, many different brands of Scotch whiskey, each brand had a different price. Some brands were considered very low quality. They were cheap Scotch whiskey. And some brands were considered very high quality. They were expensive Scotch whiskey. The cheap ones had plain labels. The expensive ones had very fancy labels, maybe even different bottles. He said this: it all came from the same barrel. He would receive an order to put the labels for so many bottles of this kind of whiskey, and he would get out the labels and put those labels on that kind, and then he would get the order to put another kind of whiskey. He'd get other labels and put labels on other bottles. On the face of it, the product looked different because the label was different, but inside it was all the same stuff. We relate to God, who loves us, who watches over us, who cares for us, who protects us, in all of us, in the same way, no matter what's on our face, no matter what's inside of us. We are all in God's presence, no matter what faith we proclaim. In fact, even if we proclaim no faith at all, we are in God's presence because we all live, move, and have our being in God. So seeing God's face, or God's rear end, or only the palm of God's hand shielding us from seeing anything, it's all the same from God's side. On our side, however, God's presence, God's protection, God's love, inside each of us as individuals, or inside us as a church, that's where the difference happens for us. So hear the word of the pretty lady leaning on her darkened door and ask for more. Hear the word of the beggar leaning on his crutch. And don't ask for so much. But don't forget to ask. Don't forget to dream big dreams and take those big dreams to God. The answer that comes from God might be, as God said to Moses sometimes, okay. It might be, well, maybe not that much, but this much. God's answer could be no. God's answer could be not now. But from the hand of God, receive whatever you are given, even if that's only a glimpse of God's backside. Because you are in the presence of the splendor of God. You are in hearing distance of God's holy name. And you are an object of God's compassion. So let that be enough for now. But keep seeking for more. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Let us pray. Call us on, God. Call us on to ever seek more. And to ever be satisfied with what you give us. In Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.